Welcome to Cybersecurity from Scratch, Technical Foundations, Episode 11, Phishing. In today's episode, we're not deviating much from the formula. First, we're going to talk about how phishing attack workflows work, and then we'll talk about interrupting those workflows on the defensive side. First, what do we mean by phishing? Technically, phishing can apply to any type of attempt to pretend to be someone else, to use electronic means to gain access to someone else's data and information. But in this context, we specifically mean when an attacker uses an email to try to get someone to either install some software that they shouldn't on their local system, or give some information away, or somehow surrender information that they shouldn't have under false pretexts. We also have spearfishing, which is a variation on phishing, where instead of targeting a broad pool of individuals or just sort of shotgunning emails out into the ether, you're targeting either a specific individual or a small pool of individuals with a highly targeted attack that's looking more specifically at their particular context because they're some sort of high-value target. There are three basic phases to the attack. The first is to identify email addresses that are going to be attacked and figure out what the strategy is going to be for approaching them. The second is to actually craft a payload and figure out how to make the attack, put it all together. And then the third step is, of course, to deploy the attack and actually launch it against the victims. To identify the target, there's a couple different ways that the red team can go about doing this. The first is to use a tool like the Harvester, which gathers publicly visible email addresses associated with a particular domain. Another technique, which is usually used by the bad guys, is to buy email list dumps off the darknet, often for some nominal amount of cryptocurrency. And this can be either just a dump of all email addresses with no filtering whatsoever, just some sort of basic sanity check to see that they're valid, or it can be for a particular organization. There's honestly a ton of variation in how this actually plays out. Another means for getting email addresses is to sort of troll forums and paste bin dumps. Often hackers, to kind of show off or to advertise their darknet dumps, will put up some snippet of their list of emails, and these can be big enough that sometimes people can use those all by themselves to build up phishing attacks. Now, from a spearfishing perspective, the attacker often only needs one email or some small subset of emails. And in this case, they're going to be using much more targeted means, where they're doing some manual research into the individual or individuals they're targeting and trying to gather more information about the specific systems that they're targeting so that they can eventually move to the second step with much more precision. In the next step of the attack, the attacker will actually craft the payload. Perhaps the scariest way this can happen is when they will use a CVE or an actual software vulnerability as part of their payload. These can be particularly scary because often the victim doesn't actually have to do anything. Simply receiving the email might take advantage of some vulnerability in the email application, and it's off to the races with the attack at that point. However, these attacks are often ephemeral, as usually patching will catch the vulnerability fairly quickly, so the attacker only has a brief window to launch the attack. Or alternatively, the attacker has done some research on a particular environment and has reason to think that someone is behind on their patch cycle. Another way to go about this, and perhaps a much more successful way, is to use inherent weaknesses in the user environment. So you're trying to exploit user error or negligence to trigger the attack and run the software. So there's something just inherent about the way the user system is set up that if the attacker is able to trick the user into doing something they shouldn't, then the malicious payload will run. Another variation is the imposter link, where the victim is tricked into going to some web page that looks legit, and they actually just give the attacker some username and password information or financial data or what have you, something that can be used to do further attacks later, or might be an ends in and of itself. The second category I listed, where the attacker uses some sort of software in the victim's environment and the victim's error to trigger an attack, has many different variations, but I'll go over a few examples. The hypertext application, or htafile, is one of those vulnerabilities that gets used a lot for phishing attacks. So someone had a great idea back in the 90s to basically take a web page and put the same kind of VB scripts behind it that you might be writing in your desktop for your business process management and so forth. But then you can have this nice GUI for it. It's very easy to edit and modify. It's easy to pass around, and you can power some really cool, quick things at very low cost for your business. The problem is that there's not really a lot of controls on it. It's just an HTML file with some scripts behind it, and once that script is run, it has full permissions to your data and everything. So unfortunately, it's really easy to put in a malicious payload. It seemed like a great idea back in the 90s, but unfortunately, it's still biting us today, as it comes bundled with Windows by default, and you have to go out of your way to stop your users from doing stuff like this. So let's see an htafile in action. So here we start out with this normal looking HTML page with a HTML tag, the head tag, the title tag, and so forth. But then under the script, where instead of seeing JavaScript, we actually see some VB script. And I'm going to now walk you through what this script does. Now, it's a little bit complicated because it's a multi-step process, and honestly, each step in this process is its own episode all by itself, so don't worry too much about grabbing all the details. This is more about giving the general flavor of what can happen with an HTA file and, roughly how it's working. So in VBScript, I'm using VBScript to write out a small C# program to the hard drive. You can see it here declared in one big long variable. And what that C# program, when run, is going to do is it takes the tiny bit of code that I've written here, reaches out to an HTTP server, pulls down a bigger program, some sort of malware, and then builds it and runs it. So the actual malware that's doing real nefarious things doesn't even exist in this script. It's going to be grabbed in real time. So the attacker has the ability to swap these in and out. So this whole idea of C# staging can be used to really nefarious effect, and there's some cool ways to counter it, but that's a later episode down the road, so we'll talk about that later. So then we go down and we see that the script here is saving this little C# program to a little folder called test under app data. It will then compile the program using the .NET framework, which comes bundled with Windows. So it's all ready to go. And then it will create a registry key entry under current version run, which will, once the user basically logs back in again after a restart, run the program. So if the user is phished, they might download this program, this HTA file, they might run it. They won't see anything happen for a little while, and then just after a reboot one day, they've got some malware running. Now, obviously, there's no one particular vector that malware can use, and honestly, this is a pretty clumsy, obvious way of doing it. So a real attacker is probably going to do something a lot more subtle. But again, we'll talk about what makes this not particularly subtle when we get to persistence and some of the other topics related to malware infiltration. So let's see it actually work. So let's see if the attack actually launch. So we fire up the HTA file. And there, the attack is run. It's done. We go and check out local. The executable is there. Check out regedit. Key is there. That's it. Next time you reboot and log in, that's the game. The malware is run. Office macros aren't nearly as insecure as they used to be. However, they can still be a problem. The basic idea is that Microsoft Office allows user-generated code to be run in documents, which allows for some really powerful features where, for example, spreadsheets can pull in information from other files and do complex business process calculations on them. It's a really neat capability when used correctly. However, the problem is that when a new Office file from an external host comes in, there might be some malicious code in there, and there's not really a great way to screen and make sure that that code is something that you really want to be running on your system, unless you have much more lockdown over your macros, but that's something we'll talk about later. So there have been some substantial advances inherently in the technology where, for example, before 2007, all your Office files or your Word files were just simply called .doc, and now there's a .docm to show it has a macro versus a .docx. So you can see, yes, this file does have a macro, it can run, versus no, this file can't. There's also warnings right now when Office files come from external hosts, and so that will tell you, for example, that there's a macro, it's from an untrusted provider. Now, of course, you can still trick the user into saying, oh yeah, I accept that, okay, let it run, but at least there's more protections than in the old days. Now, to show what an evil macro can do, I was a little bit lazy and just used the exact same VB code from my HTA example here, where when you open up the Excel file, you will be presented with a macro, or rather the computer will be presented with a macro which it will run, and it'll do the exact same thing. It takes the C# code, which goes and builds more C# code, and then puts it into a directory, puts in a registry key, and bam, it all just sort of runs automatically. Now, Office macros are a lot safer than they used to be. Let's try opening up this evil file just for the demo. And we can see first thing that Microsoft actually tried to protect us from ourselves and says, hey, macros are disabled here. Are you really, really sure you want to take a look at that? And we can actually fire up the developer tab and open the macro to look and make sure. Now, of course, you're probably not doing that every time you receive a file. If this file is coming from, some particular person in accounting who you trust, you're probably just going to say, all right, enable. And you can make the file a trusted document, which will then allow it to run. And honestly, you probably would do that if it's from someone you trust and it's a document you're checking all the time. And look at that. Whoops. I'm hacked. Ouch. Now, Microsoft does go a step further with files that get brought down from the public internet or even from an email client and says, this particular file is from an external host. You really don't want to be executing these macros. We're going to open it in read-only mode and basically force you to go back in and change the mode manually. And some users don't even know how to do that. Now, of course, if it's part of your nominal workflow to get spreadsheets or what kind of documents from some external entity, then your employees might be accustomed to overriding these controls. They're all really good and they do genuinely help, but at the same time, it's all too easy to get conditioned to just hit enable, bam, and then it runs. So this vector is still quite viable, and again, it's something that gets used quite regularly. One technology that has a lot of good protections around it, but users can still be tricked into bypassing those protections, is the Click Once installer. So Microsoft allows installers to be bundled in such a way that they're hosted on the web or on local media, and then the user is basically asked, do you want to install this software? It calls itself blah, blah, blah. It's from blah, blah, blah individual or organization. Do you want to trust it? And once the user hits yes, then it just is all over. The whole installation happens without any further intervention. And if it's a bad piece of software, then that's it. The problem is that attackers are pretty good at impersonating real organizations. They can use illegitimately issued certificates from some questionably legal certificate authorities to make themselves sound legitimate. Often you can buy a certificate from overseas, somewhere that's in the trust chain, and you can use that certificate to look legitimate. And of course, the user is being asked. They're always being asked. However, if the user can be tricked into thinking that the sender of the email is, from their local library and this is their, new e-reader client or something like that, then suddenly the attacker has access. That installer is all they need to put down any arbitrary piece of malware, overwrite registry keys as long as they're running user permission space, and basically have all the rights that user has to the system. To actually deploy the attack, the attempt is going to look a little bit different depending on if the attacker is spear phishing or launching a bulk phishing attack. For spear phishing, often they're interacting individually with the victim, going through email correspondence and by hand doing interaction with them. Maybe there's phone calls, some sort of pretexting and so forth, and often that final email where they actually deploy the malicious software is just the last leg of the attack. However, for a wider campaign where thousands or tens of thousands of people are being emailed, some management software is involved. Often phishing test software is misused for real attacks. Often the attacker will have something custom that ties in with their command and control framework, but we'll talk about that when we talk about command and control frameworks. Now let's look at this from the defensive side of things. Given what we've seen, how do we prevent these sort of attacks from happening? And unfortunately, the short answer is there really isn't a magic solution. This is one of those things where security is everybody's job, and users ultimately have responsibility for the access that they have and need to be taught to treat it appropriately. The first and biggest thing that we can do to prevent phishing attacks is teach people what the risks are. Show people what a phishing attack looks like and how they can recognize it, what they can do in response. Be specific and actionable. Make sure that there's some sort of company policy for what to do when a phishing email is received so that people can know that an attack is underway or an attempted attack is underway. And what happens if an attack has been successful? So say the user has clicked on the link, make sure that everyone knows exactly what they should be doing in that situation. Make sure it's something simple that people can remember under a pressure situation. Remember, there's no patch for humans. Because people need to access systems, inherently they're going to have some level of control over the system, and you just need to train people to use that access responsibly. Next, after the users have been educated, follow up with some actual tests. Most users think they're smart enough not to click on a phishing email. Basically, everybody's sitting there in the training thinking, oh yeah, I'm not dumb enough to fall for that. So actually run a test campaign to validate that assumption. These tests will first show the users that they're fallible. So if someone should click on it, maybe they'll learn that, well, they clicked on the phishing link, they probably shouldn't do that, and they are vulnerable to that. And for the people who, maybe do know what to look for, it does increase vigilance as it trips that little filter every once in a while saying, oh, yeah, that's an attack, I shouldn't click on that. And so it has a generally beneficial effect on helping people understand that these effects are real. So it'll also then show to management the effectiveness of training and education. So if you can show over time that the response rate for these fake attacks anyway, is going down, that will show that your organization is becoming more and more resistant to those sorts of attacks. There are a lot of cool frameworks that you can use for this, such as GoFish and Kingfisher. One great strategy for lowering the risk profile is to block some of these vulnerable files from originating from outside the organization. So for example, if htafile, Office macro files, etc. never need to come in from the outside, you can simply block those entirely from outside the organization. The attacker can still get in by sending a malicious link, which would allow someone to download something, but it's extra steps and it's just a little bit harder to pull off the attack. Stopping attacks from the outside is one thing. However, realistically, you're not going to be able to stop everything. And so thinking a step beyond to what happens when one of our user accounts is compromised, it makes sense to look at blocking these files from moving within the organization if user workflows permit this. Because unfortunately, once one user account is compromised, then hijacking some email spreadsheet could be used to spread around more malware and further extend to the extent of compromise. Something that can be done to mitigate this risk is using SharePoint to exchange files. However, at this point, files are still inherently vulnerable. Like, it's still inherently possible to embed malicious code in a macro. And so really you have to go a step beyond that to look at ways of securing those files further. If macros are needed in your organization, and really they probably are, macros are incredibly powerful and useful, then there are ways of making them safer. One way to do this is to require the macro to be signed before it's executed, and this can be enforced by a system policy. The signature validates that the code hasn't been modified after being approved by the signing authority, and so that makes modification of the macro or creation of a malicious macro way more difficult, because now the attacker needs to gain the ability to create a signature that will be accepted as valid as well. This is very difficult, and so in secure environments that require macros, really signing them is the way to go. Allowing just any user to write any old macro is really not an optimal situation. Sometimes it can't be avoided. However, if at all possible, try to implement some sort of signing strategy. So requiring that macros are signed is a great step in making sure that that particular vector is closed down. However, click-once installers and the general threat of users downloading and running software still allows the user to basically run whatever code they want within limits, and opens the door for attackers to trick them into downloading and running some sort of malicious software. Really, the way to counter this is, for a highly secure environment anyway, is to introduce a approved software list, where, if at least your user workflows can let you get away with this, require every single piece of software running on the client to be approved. Now, this requires one of two things, or both. The first being that your user workflows are homogeneous enough that you can have a central organization figure out what everybody needs, review all that software, and approve it. Or alternatively, if user workflows are not consistent, you have some sort of expensive oversight of the system to make sure that everything that everyone wants to run is allowed to work in that baseline. Oftentimes, this kind of oversight can cost more than the value of the information of the system that you're protecting, and so in practice, it can be very expensive to roll this out. Windows Defender Application Control is the software that facilitates this for Windows, and it comes bundled by default these days. Even though the software comes bundled by default, actually using it is much more tricky. I mean, think about it. Think about every time that you, as part of your daily job, have just downloaded some, special plugin for a different application that, is not part of anybody else's workflow. It's just something that you personally find useful, or, something, especially like a software developer, downloading a new tool to try out. Every time that you'd want to do something like that, you'd have to run it by security. That's really expensive, both in terms of the number of hours that it takes to review all the submissions, as well as interrupting user workflows. Like every time you're interrupting someone and not allowing them to do their job, that costs a lot of money. And so really, a lot of times using this kind of technology is incredibly expensive, and it simply might not be worth it. In our next episode, we're going to be taking a look at server message block, which is a technology which has been abused several times over the last couple decades to launch some truly terrifying attacks. We'll look at what it is and why vulnerabilities in this technology are so scary, and some of the particular attacks that attackers have used. And then we'll look at some of the things that we can do to protect ourselves in the future, with the assumption that if it's happened before, it'll probably happen again.